Welcome to Dinner and a Mystery. I am your host, Vicki, and tonight we're going to be making Crockpot Chicken Pot Pie, and we're going to go over a mystery about Spider-Man. Be sure and stay tuned. Let's get started. All right, tonight's recipe is going to be from TikTok, and it's Recipes with Scotty, so be sure and check him out. It's a Crockpot Chicken Pot Pie recipe. So you're going to need boneless, skinless chicken breast or thighs, about 2 pounds. You're going to need 3 cups of frozen mixed vegetables, so that's the peas, carrots, corn, green beans. Then you're going to need a half a cup of heavy cream or half and half, and a half a cup of sour cream or Greek yogurt. Also, while you're at the store, grab you some Grand's biscuits or some of the big Great Value biscuits, or at least 2 cans of the small biscuits. I add small biscuits on this because I have made this recipe before, and that's usually what I have on stock or in my house. You're going to add the chicken to your crock pot with your frozen vegetables and your cream of chicken soup, your broth, and your seasonings, and you're going to let that cook for 6 to 7 hours on high or 3 to 4 hours on low until your chicken is fully cooked. Be sure and grab a meat thermometer and check it before you do anything else, because nobody's got time for salmonella. I'm just saying. Once your chicken is cooked, you're going to take it out of the crock pot and shred it, or take your mixer, your little hand mixer, and mix it around. Pretty much you can shred your chicken that way. If your liner is in the crock pot and you use a mixer, be careful. I've done that, and I've grabbed the liner into the mixer and I made a bigger mess than I intended. It was not fun to clean up. I ended up having to take the chicken out and shred it anyway. Just watch that if you have the liner and you use a mixer and you mix it to shred the chicken, just be careful. All right, now we shredded the chicken. We're going to stick it back in the crock pot. We're going to add your heavy cream and your sour cream, and then your frozen vegetables, and you're going to cook it for another 10 to 15 minutes. While all that is cooking, you're going to throw your biscuits in the oven and bake them. Once that is done, you're going to take your biscuits and you're going to put them on the plate, 1 or 2, depending on how big of an appetite you have, and then pour your chicken mixture over your biscuits. And it's just that easy. While you're having dinner, we're going to talk about Spider-Man of Denver. The story of Theodore Coneys. So tonight's story is equal parts unbelievable and unsettling. Settle in and let me tell you about Theodore Edward Coneys, the man who became known as the Denver Spider-Man. A man with nowhere to go. He was born in 1882 in Illinois. He was a sickly child, constantly ill. He was confined indoors with his mom watching him all the time. So he didn't get to go out and play with other kids. He was tired of just being confined in the house, but the doctors were sure that he was not going to make it to his 18th birthday. And despite all that, he did make it to his 18th birthday, and he actually was 70 years old whenever this story took place. Now, when Theodore was young, his father passed away. That left the mom struggling to care for a chronically ill child. With no better option, she had to pick up and go where the work was across the country, and ended up in Denver, Colorado, where she worked as a housekeeper, had very low wages. It was the Great Depression. Theodore was left alone quite often, and isolation became a place where he was content and familiar. He was used to the bitterness and boredom of his life, and just watching other kids play when he couldn't because he was so sick. After his 18th birthday, he had odd jobs like bookkeeping, advertising, sales. And then, as you can imagine, with his appearance, he was thin and pale and gangly looking with long fingers, and he just didn't look healthy, that he was turned away quite often from society. He had to rely on the kindness of others to get through life. He didn't really have a place to live because it was the Great Depression. It was harder and harder to find work. But he became friends with Philip Peters, a retired railroad auditor and musician. Peters and Coney had known each other through a mandolin club years earlier. Now, if you don't know what a mandolin is, it's a stringed instrument in the lute family and is generally plucked with a pick and commonly has 4 courses of double strings tuned in unison, giving it a total of 8 strings. So it kind of looks like a tiny guitar. So when Coney's found himself cold, hungry, and desperate, he decided to visit Peters, his old friend from the mandolin club, to ask for some help. Now, Peters wasn't home because his wife was in the hospital recovering from hip surgery from a broken hip. So she was going to be in there for a while. Remember, it was during the Great Depression, so hospital stays were a lot longer. Today, if you break a hip, they hand you a Band-Aid and an aspirin and send you home. But back then, you got to stay for a while. So Peters wasn't home, but Coney's found that the door was unlocked. So he let himself in. And while exploring the house, he discovered a tiny trap door. It was in a closet ceiling. Behind it was a cramped attic crawl space, barely big enough for a man to lay down. Instead of leaving, Coney's moved in. Yep, he secretly took up residence in that tiny attic space above Peter's head, without him knowing. He stayed for weeks. He crept out only at night to steal food from the kitchen and tiptoe around the house. He listened and would wait. He would wait for Peters to leave the house to go to the hospital, and then he would crawl down and look for food and go to the bathroom. He lived like a ghost. Coney's kept to that schedule, but one day, Philip Peters did not go to the hospital and saw Coney's and confronted him. He grabbed his walking stick and attacked Coney's, but Coney's wielded an antique gun that he had found in the house. He struck Peters over the head and it broke the gun. Then, in a panic, he grabbed an antique iron shaker off of the stove and bludgeoned him to death. So while Peters lay dying, Coney's ran back up into his crawl space where he hid. The police were baffled because there was no signs of forced entry. Now, back in those days, there was no DNA and no crime scene video places to look, no doorbell ring cams, nothing like that. They had to go on pure instinct. And, of course, there was nothing. They had no one missing valuables. They didn't have any neighbors reporting suspicious activity because he had been in the house for a really long time. Now, the trap door to the attic was discovered, but because it was so tiny, the police didn't really give it much thought, just kind of dismissed it as something that just was irrelevant. After Philip's murder, his wife finally was discharged from the hospital. This woman must have been in the hospital for a while. And despite the tragedy, she did return back to her house where she lived because that's where she had raised her children and lived with her husband, and she wanted to go back to that home. She had spent over 50 years of her life there. But something had shifted in the house, and she couldn't explain what it was. She would hear strange noises at night. You know, it was kind of scary, I guess, being there by yourself. You try to dismiss it, but you hear things. I mean, you're not sure, is your mind playing tricks on you? So she hired a housekeeper to live with her, and the housekeeper quit because she kept hearing different things coming from the ceiling in the attic, and she was scared that there was a ghost as well. Now, there is a version where Mrs. Peters hired a nurse to care for her while she recovered from this hip surgery that she was in the hospital for a really long time. So the nurse began to hear rattles, and she would see a person fleeing around the corner, and she chalked it up to there was a ghost in the house. It was haunted. I'm sure back then it was probably a lot scarier because there was no video evidence of anything going on. Like I said, back then, you had to kind of go on instinct, and her instinct was, I'm going to get out of here. Now, the police, they were called all the time because of the noises. They would investigate and never find anything. It kept getting worse and worse. They kept getting more and more calls, and they were trying to figure out exactly what was going on. Neighbors were starting to see lights come on and a pale figure at the window with scraggly hair. Now, because of all this scariness, Mrs. Peters had moved out. And the police were still kind of investigating the house because neighbors would hear and see things. It became quite obvious that this house was haunted, at least to them. But one day after a routine check, one police officer, he opened the door and he saw two legs disappear into the attic. It was Theodore Coney's, pale, emaciated, and wild-eyed. He had been living in the crawl space for over 5 weeks after the murder, surviving off scraps and staying silent. Well, I guess not that silent. The space was only 27 inches high. Coney's had contorted himself in a suffocating space in the dark, hiding from the world. The media dubbed him the Spider-Man of Denver. Not for any superhero qualities, but for the creepy, arachnid-like way he slithered in and out of the attic. Coney's was convicted of murder and died in prison in 1967, but his story became a legend, an urban myth that turned out to be horrifyingly true. And the attic, it's still there in Denver, sealed up. Now it remains one of the eeriest crime scenes in American history. Now for a couple of, I'm not sure if they're facts or not, but the house that was built in 1895 still stands. Recently it was sold for $675,000. I'm not sure if this is true, if it did sell or not. But also, was it revealed to them everything that happened in the house? That it was considered haunted for a long time because there was a man living in the attic that stored his waste in the corner in bags and didn't shower the whole time he was there. So I'm sure that it had a smell for quite a while, and that's what the neighbors were smelling, by the way. All right. So there was an episode of CSI about this. It was called Stalker, and it was season 2, episode 16, which was aired in 2002, and it was inspired by the Denver Spider-Man. He was also referenced in Beware the Curves, a 1956 novel by Earl Gardner. So those are just 2 little fun facts about the Denver Spider-Man, Theodore Coney's. The next time you hear a creak in your ceiling or you see a shadow where it doesn't belong, just remember Theodore Coney's. Sometimes the scariest things aren't in your nightmares. They're living right above you.